I stood frozen in my living room, staring at the shattered pieces of medical equipment scattered across the floor. The soft hum that had been my baby's lifeline for 3 months was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made my blood run cold. Linda Martinez stood in my doorway, clipboard clutched in her hands, her face twisted with satisfaction. She had no idea what she had just done. No idea that the machine she had just destroyed was the only thing keeping my premature son alive. No idea that in her quest to enforce HOA regulations, she had just committed multiple felonies. But most importantly, she had no idea who I really was. My badge was upstairs in my bedroom drawer. My uniform hung in the closet. For 3 months, I had been just another new father in Sunset Ridge. Linda Martinez was about to learn that some mistakes cannot be undone. 3 months ago, my life changed forever when my son arrived 12 weeks early. The doctors at Memorial Hospital were blunt about his chances. His lungs were not developed. His immune system was weak. He needed specialized care that only a medical-grade incubator could provide. My wife Sarah had complications during delivery that kept her in the hospital for 2 weeks. While she recovered, I transformed our modest home in Sunset Ridge into a makeshift medical facility. The living room became a sterile environment with monitors, oxygen tanks, and the most important piece of equipment in our world, a state-of-the-art incubator that cost more than my truck. The machine was not pretty to look at. It was large, white, and covered in blinking lights and digital displays. Tubes and wires connected to various monitors that tracked every breath my son took. The soft hum of the ventilation system became the soundtrack of our lives. That sound meant he was breathing. It meant he was alive. I positioned the incubator near the front window where it could get natural light. The pediatric specialist said sunlight was important for his development. The location also made it easier for the visiting nurses who came twice daily to check his progress. Everything was arranged for one purpose: keeping my baby alive until he was strong enough to breathe on his own. I work in law enforcement, though I kept that detail private from my neighbors. In a community like Sunset Ridge, people make assumptions about cops. Some see us as heroes. Others see us as threats. I preferred to just be David Thompson, the guy in house number 47 who worked long hours and kept to himself. That changed on a Tuesday morning when Linda Martinez knocked on my door. Linda was the HOA president, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She introduced herself with the authority of someone who took her volunteer position very seriously. "Mr. Thompson, I am conducting property inspections this week," she said, glancing past me toward the living room. "I noticed you have some unusual equipment visible from the street." I invited her in, hoping a face-to-face conversation would help her understand the situation. Linda stepped inside and immediately focused on the incubator. Her expression shifted from curious to disapproving. "This medical equipment is quite unsightly," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "Our community standards require that all personal property maintain aesthetic appeal. This setup is clearly visible from the street and affects our neighborhood's property values." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Mrs. Martinez, this equipment is temporary. My son was born premature and needs specialized care. The incubator is keeping him alive while his lungs develop." Linda barely glanced at the tiny baby sleeping peacefully inside the clear chamber. Her focus remained on her clipboard and the violation she was documenting. "I understand your situation, but rules are rules," she replied. "The equipment needs to be moved away from public view or covered appropriately. I will be sending you an official notice with specific requirements." I felt my jaw tighten but kept my voice calm. This is a medical necessity. Moving the equipment could endanger my son's health. "Then you will need to find an alternative solution," Linda said, already heading toward the door. "The HOA exists to protect everyone's property values. I am sure you understand." As she walked away, I realized this was not going to be a simple conversation about community guidelines. This was going to be a fight. The official HOA violation notice arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail like I was some kind of criminal. The document was typed on official letterhead with Linda's signature at the bottom, making the whole thing feel like a legal proceeding. "Violation of Community Standards Medical Equipment Display" was printed in bold letters across the top. Below that, a detailed description of my alleged offense and the required corrective action. I had 30 days to remove all medical equipment from public view or face escalating fines and potential legal action. I called Linda that evening, hoping we could work out a reasonable solution. She answered on the third ring with the tone of someone who had been expecting my call. "Mrs. Martinez, this is David Thompson from Maple Street. I received your notice today and wanted to discuss possible alternatives." "Mr. Thompson, the violation is clear and the solution is simple. Move the equipment or cover it. The choice is yours." I could hear the television playing in the background, some game show with audience laughter. She was treating this conversation like an interruption of her evening entertainment. "You have to understand, this is not just equipment. This is life support for my infant son. Moving it could cause serious medical complications." "I am not a medical professional, Mr. Thompson. I am an HOA president trying to maintain community standards. Every resident must follow the same rules." The dismissive tone in her voice made my hands clench into fists. I had spent 15 years in law enforcement dealing with difficult people, but something about Linda's cold indifference toward my family's crisis pushed every button I had. "Mrs. Martinez, I am asking for temporary flexibility while my son recovers. This equipment will be gone as soon as the doctors clear him for normal care. The rules do not have provisions for temporary exceptions. If they did, everyone would claim special circumstances." I heard her television volume increase, like she was trying to signal the end of our conversation. "How long has your son been on this equipment?" she asked, though her tone suggested she did not really care about the answer. 3 months. The doctors estimate another 4 to 6 weeks before he can transition to regular care. That is quite a long time to expect your neighbors to tolerate this eyesore. Eyesore. She called my son's life support an eyesore. I ended the call without saying goodbye. The next morning, I drove to the pediatric center for our weekly consultation with Dr. Patricia Wells. She had been overseeing my son's care since the day he was born, and I trusted her judgment completely. "Dr. Wells, I need to ask about moving the incubator. Our HOA is requiring us to relocate the equipment away from public view." Her expression immediately turned serious. "David, moving that equipment right now would be extremely risky. The incubator maintains precise temperature, humidity, and oxygen levels. Even a brief disruption could cause respiratory distress." She pulled up my son's medical chart on her computer, scrolling through weeks of carefully tracked data. "Look at these numbers," she continued. "His oxygen levels have been stable for 2 weeks, but he is still not ready for environmental changes. Moving the incubator could set his progress back by weeks or even months." "What if we move it to a back room?" The location you chose is perfect. Natural light, proper ventilation, easy access for monitoring. Moving it to a confined space could create problems we cannot predict. Dr. Wells leaned back in her chair, studying my face carefully. David, is someone pressuring you to move this equipment? Because if they are, they need to understand they are asking you to risk your son's life for cosmetic reasons. I drove home that afternoon with Dr. Wells' words echoing in my mind. Linda Martinez was asking me to choose between my son's health and HOA compliance. For her, it was about property values and community standards. For me, it was about keeping my child alive. That night, I sat in the darkness next to the incubator, listening to the gentle hum of the machines. My son slept peacefully, unaware of the battle being fought over his right to medical care. I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I would not move the equipment. I would not risk my son's life to satisfy Linda's obsession with neighborhood aesthetics. Whatever consequences came from that choice, I would face them head on. I had no idea how far Linda was willing to go to win this fight. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like Sunset Ridge. By the end of the week, everyone knew about the dispute between the HOA president and the guy with the sick baby. People took sides quickly, and the lines were drawn exactly where you would expect them to be. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, stopped by with homemade soup and quiet words of support. "That woman has lost her mind," she whispered, glancing around like Linda might be hiding in the bushes. "What kind of person picks a fight with a family going through this?" But support came with conditions. Mrs. Chen and others who sympathized with our situation were careful to keep their opinions private. Linda had been HOA president for 6 years, and she had a reputation for making life difficult for people who crossed her. On the other side were Linda's core supporters, led by Robert Hayes, a retired insurance executive who lived 2 streets over. Robert made his position clear during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "Nothing personal, Thompson, but rules are rules. If we start making exceptions, where does it end? Next thing you know, everyone will have some excuse for breaking community standards." His wife nodded along, adding, "Property values affect everyone. We all have to make sacrifices for the good of the community." I wanted to ask her what sacrifices she had made lately, but I bit my tongue. Getting into arguments in the produce section was not going to help my son. Linda was smart about building her case. She framed the issue as fairness and equal treatment rather than acknowledging what it really was: a sick baby fighting for his life. She circulated emails to all residents explaining the importance of maintaining standards and how exceptions would create precedent for future violations. Her emails never mentioned that the violation involved medical equipment, never mentioned that a premature infant's life was at stake. She described it as non-compliance with aesthetic standards and refusal to cooperate with reasonable requests. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to present my side of the story. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building that felt more like a courtroom when Linda was running the show. 15 residents attended, more than usual for a monthly board meeting. Linda sat at the head table with her clipboard and a stack of official-looking documents. The other board members, Tom Silva and Janet Park, flanked her like supporting actors in her performance. "We have several items on tonight's agenda," Linda began, "including an ongoing violation that requires board attention." She did not mention my name, but everyone knew what violation she was referring to. I raised my hand during the public comment period. "I would like to address the medical equipment issue." Linda's smile tightened. Mr. Thompson, this is not a debate. This is a compliance matter that has already been documented and communicated. I understand that, but I think the community deserves to hear the full context of the situation. The context is irrelevant. The violation exists regardless of the circumstances. Tom Silva, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Linda, maybe we should let him explain the medical necessity. Tom, we cannot make exceptions based on personal circumstances. If we do that, every violation will come with a sob story. Sob story. She called my son's fight for life a sob story. I stood up, feeling the eyes of my neighbors on me. My 3-month-old son was born 12 weeks premature. The equipment you want me to hide is keeping him alive. Moving it could cause respiratory failure. The room fell silent. Several people looked genuinely shocked, like they were hearing these details for the first time. Robert Hayes cleared his throat. That is tragic, but it does not change the fact that the equipment is visible from the street. Mrs. Chen stood up from the back row. Robert, how can you sit there and talk about street visibility when there is a baby's life at stake? Because property values affect all of us, Robert replied. We cannot let emotions override practical considerations. Linda seized control of the moment. This discussion is getting off track. The violation stands as written. Mr. Thompson has received proper notice and has time to comply. She moved to the next agenda item without allowing further comment. I sat there feeling like I had just been dismissed by a judge who had already made up her mind. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me with quiet words of support, but they were careful not to let Linda see them talking to me. The message was clear. People might sympathize with my situation, but they were not willing to risk becoming Linda's next target. I drove home that night knowing I was fighting this battle alone. Linda had successfully turned a medical crisis into a political issue, and she was winning. The 30-day deadline was approaching fast, and Linda had made it clear there would be no extensions. She sent me 3 additional notices in the final week, each one more threatening than the last. Daily fines of $50 would begin immediately after the deadline. Legal action would follow if the violation was not corrected within 60 days. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He reviewed the covenants and restrictions for Sunset Ridge and delivered news I did not want to hear. Legally, they have the right to enforce these standards, he explained. The medical necessity might give us grounds for a reasonable accommodation claim, but that could take months to resolve in court. Months, my son could be off the equipment in weeks. Unfortunately, the legal system does not move that fast. You could spend more money fighting this than the fines would cost. I left his office feeling trapped between an impossible choice and an unreasonable deadline. But the choice became clear when my son had a medical episode that showed me exactly what was at stake. It was a Thursday morning, and I was getting ready for work when the incubator's alarm began sounding. The oxygen saturation monitor showed dangerously low levels, and my son's breathing became labored and irregular. I called the emergency pediatric line while checking all the equipment connections. The ventilation system was working properly, but something was causing respiratory distress. The nurse instructed me to increase the oxygen flow and monitor his response. For 20 minutes, I watched the numbers on the screen, adjusting settings according to the nurse's instructions. Gradually, his breathing stabilized and the alarm stopped, but those 20 minutes showed me how quickly everything could go wrong. Dr. Wells confirmed what I already knew when I called her later that day. David, This is exactly why we cannot risk moving that equipment. His respiratory system is still fragile. Any environmental change could trigger another episode like this one. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not comply with Linda's deadline. I would not move the equipment. I would pay whatever fines were necessary and fight whatever legal battles came next. My son's life was worth more than HOA compliance. I called Linda to inform her of my decision. Mrs. Martinez, I will not be moving the medical equipment by your deadline. My son's doctor has advised that moving the incubator could endanger his life. Mr. Thompson, that is your choice, but you need to understand the consequences. Fines will begin immediately, and we will pursue all available legal remedies. I understand. You are being very stubborn about this. I am being a father. 2 days after the deadline, Linda decided to conduct what she called a compliance inspection. She arrived at my house at 10 in the morning with Robert Hayes and Janet Park, the other board members serving as witnesses. I was at work, but Sarah was home recovering from her recent surgery. She was still weak and spending most of her time resting in the bedroom upstairs. The sound of persistent knocking woke her from a nap. Mrs. Thompson, this is Linda Martinez from the HOA board. We are here to document the ongoing violation for our legal proceedings. Sarah, still groggy from medication, let them in without thinking about the implications. She trusted that community leaders would not do anything to harm a sick baby. Linda entered my living room with her phone, taking pictures of the incubator from multiple angles. She documented every wire, every monitor, every piece of equipment that was keeping my son alive. "This is quite an extensive setup," she commented, stepping closer to examine the incubator controls. "Please be careful," Sarah said weakly. "The equipment is very sensitive." Linda continued taking pictures, moving around the equipment to get better angles. Robert and Janet stood by the door, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. That is when everything went wrong. Linda leaned over the incubator to photograph the control panel, and her clipboard caught on one of the oxygen tubes. Instead of carefully disconnecting it, she yanked the clipboard free, pulling the tube loose from its connection. The incubator's alarm immediately began sounding. My son's oxygen levels started dropping as the disconnected tube pumped air uselessly into the room instead of into his chamber. "Oh," Linda said, staring at the disconnected tube like it was a minor inconvenience. Sarah rushed to reconnect the tube, but Linda was still standing in the way, trying to turn off the alarm by pressing random buttons on the control panel. "Please move," Sarah pleaded. "I need to fix this." Instead of stepping aside, Linda continued pressing buttons. "I am just trying to stop this noise." That is when she pressed the wrong button, the main power switch. The incubator went silent. All the monitors went dark. The gentle hum that had been my son's lifeline for 3 months was gone. Sarah screamed. I was 20 minutes away when my phone rang. I broke every speed limit getting home, but 20 minutes felt like 20 hours when your child's life is hanging in the balance. Sarah's panicked voice kept replaying in my head. "The machine is broken. She broke the machine. The baby is not breathing right." I called 911 while driving, requesting emergency medical transport and pediatric specialists. The dispatcher recognized the address and my voice. After 15 years as county sheriff, most of the emergency responders knew me personally. "Sheriff Thompson, we have paramedics and a pediatric team en route. ETA 4 minutes." I pulled into my driveway just as the ambulance arrived. Linda Martinez was standing on my front lawn, still clutching her clipboard, watching the chaos she had created with a mixture of shock and growing panic. Paramedic Jennifer Walsh had worked with me on dozens of emergency calls over the years. She knew me as the sheriff who always stayed calm under pressure. Today, she was seeing me as a terrified father. "David, what happened?" "Someone disconnected the life support equipment. My son is in respiratory distress." Jennifer and her partner rushed inside while I tried to explain the medical situation. The portable equipment they carried was designed for transport, not long-term care. They could stabilize my son for the trip to the hospital, but every minute counted. "We need to move fast," Jennifer said, carefully transferring my son to their transport incubator. "His oxygen levels are dangerously low." Detective Mike Rodriguez arrived just as the ambulance was pulling away. Mike had been my partner for 8 years before I was promoted to sheriff. He took one look at the broken equipment in my living room and immediately understood this was not an accident. "David, what the hell happened here?" Before I could answer, Linda Martinez approached us, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Officers, I can explain. This was an accident. I was conducting an official HOA inspection when the equipment malfunctioned." Mike looked at her, then at me, putting the pieces together quickly. "Ma'am, are you saying you were inside this residence without permission from the homeowner?" "I had permission from his wife." "And you were handling medical equipment?" Linda's story began falling apart immediately. Sarah, still shaken from the trauma, contradicted Linda's version of events. She would not move away from the machine. She kept pressing buttons even after I asked her to stop. She turned it off on purpose. Mike pulled me aside while Linda continued trying to explain herself to the other officers who had arrived. "David, you know I have to ask. Is there anything about this situation I should know? Any reason someone might target your family?" That is when I realized the truth was going to come out, whether I wanted it to or not. "Mike, she does not know I am the sheriff. She thinks I am just another resident who refuses to follow HOA rules." Mike's eyebrows shot up. "You are telling me this woman just committed multiple felonies against a county sheriff's family without knowing who she was messing with?" "That is exactly what I am telling you." I could see the wheels turning in Mike's head as he processed the legal implications. Breaking and entering, destruction of property, reckless endangerment of a child. Any one of these charges would be serious. All of them together added up to potential prison time. Linda overheard part of our conversation and suddenly realized her situation had become much more complicated. "Wait, you are a police officer." "County sheriff," Mike corrected her. "And you just destroyed medical equipment that was keeping his infant son alive." The color drained from Linda's face. She looked around frantically, as if searching for an escape route from the hole she had dug herself into. "This was an accident. I was just trying to document violations. I did not mean for anything to happen to the baby." "Ma'am, intent does not matter when the result is child endangerment," Mike explained. "You entered someone's home without proper authorization and tampered with life support equipment." My phone rang. Jennifer Walsh calling from the ambulance. "David, we are at Memorial Hospital. Your son is stable, but the doctors want to run some tests to make sure there was no damage from the oxygen disruption." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. Linda Martinez had put my child's life at risk over aesthetic concerns and property values. She had no idea how close she had come to causing a tragedy that would have destroyed multiple lives. I looked at Linda, still trying to minimize her actions and avoid responsibility. Mrs. Martinez, you are under arrest. My son spent 3 days in the hospital under observation, while doctors made sure the oxygen disruption had not caused any permanent damage. Those 3 days gave me time to focus on building the criminal case against Linda Martinez. Detective Rodriguez led the investigation with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. He interviewed Sarah, documented the damaged equipment, and collected testimony from the other HOA board members who had witnessed Linda's reckless behavior. Robert Hayes and Janet Park, who had seemed so supportive of Linda's enforcement efforts, suddenly could not distance themselves fast enough from her actions. "We never intended for anything like this to happen," Janet told Rodriguez during her interview. "Linda said she just wanted to document the violation for legal purposes. We had no idea she would start pressing buttons on medical equipment." Robert's statement was even more damaging to Linda's defense. She seemed obsessed with this particular violation. Most HOA disputes get resolved through negotiation, but Linda refused to consider any compromise. She kept saying this was about setting precedent. The district attorney, Patricia Coleman, reviewed the case personally. Pat had worked with me on dozens of cases over the years, and she understood the seriousness of what had happened. "David, we have her on breaking and entering, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment of a child. The medical documentation from the hospital shows clear harm resulting from her actions. What kind of sentence are we looking at?" "If she pleads guilty, probably 2 to 3 years with possibility of parole. If she takes it to trial and loses, could be 5 to 7 years." Linda hired an expensive defense attorney who immediately tried to frame the incident as a misunderstanding between neighbors. The lawyer argued that Linda had permission to enter the house and that the equipment malfunction was accidental. That strategy fell apart when the HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the scandal. The meeting was packed with residents who had finally learned the full truth about Linda's enforcement campaign. Mrs. Chen stood up during public comments and delivered a statement that perfectly captured the community's outrage. "For months, Linda Martinez told us this was about property values and community standards. She never mentioned that she was targeting a family with a premature baby. She never mentioned that the equipment she wanted removed was keeping a child alive." One by one, neighbors shared their own stories of Linda's harassment and abuse of power. The Martinez family next door had been fined for parking their work truck in their own driveway. The Johnsons had been cited because their fence was 6 inches too tall. The elderly couple on Oak Street had been threatened with legal action because their rose bushes extended slightly beyond their property line. A pattern emerged of a woman who used her position to bully and control her neighbors, hiding behind rules and regulations to justify petty tyranny. Tom Silva, the board member who had tried to show some compassion during that first meeting, made a motion to remove Linda from her position as HOA president. "Linda Martinez has brought shame and legal liability to our community. Her actions have put a child's life at risk and exposed the HOA to potential lawsuits. She needs to be removed immediately." The motion passed unanimously. Linda's lawyer tried one last desperate strategy, suggesting that my position as county sheriff had influenced the investigation and prosecution. "My client is being targeted because she had a dispute with a powerful law enforcement official," he argued during a pretrial hearing. Judge Patricia Wong, who had presided over dozens of cases I had investigated, was not impressed with that argument. Counselor, your client destroyed medical equipment that was keeping an infant alive. The victim's profession is irrelevant to the crimes she committed. 3 weeks later, Linda Martinez pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, and ordered to pay restitution for the damaged medical equipment. But the criminal case was only the beginning. Sarah and I filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for emotional distress, medical expenses, and the trauma our family had endured. Our attorney argued that Linda's actions were not just criminal, but represented a deliberate pattern of harassment that had culminated in endangering our child's life. The day Linda was arrested at her own home, with half the neighborhood watching from their windows, felt like justice finally being served. She was led away in handcuffs, no longer the powerful HOA president who could terrorize families with impunity. She was just another criminal who had learned that actions have consequences. My son was finally strong enough to come home without the incubator 2 weeks after Linda's arrest. Dr. Wells cleared him for normal infant care, marking the end of a medical journey that had started 4 months earlier. As I carried him into our house for the first time without life support equipment, I realized that Linda Martinez had inadvertently given us something valuable. She had shown our community what happens when petty authority goes unchecked, and she had brought neighbors together in defense of what really matters: family compassion, basic human decency, values that no HOA regulation should ever be allowed to override. 6 months later, Sunset Ridge was a different community. The new HOA board, led by Tom Silva and Mrs. Chen, rewrote the community guidelines with an emphasis on common sense and compassion over rigid enforcement. The new rules included provisions for temporary medical accommodations, reasonable neighbor dispute resolution, and protections against harassment by board members. Linda's reign of petty tyranny had taught everyone valuable lessons about the difference between leadership and bullying. My son thrived in the months following his release from medical care. He grew stronger every day, reaching developmental milestones that once seemed impossible. Dr. Wells called him a miracle baby, but I knew the real miracle was having neighbors who finally understood what community really means. The civil lawsuit against Linda was settled out of court for an amount that covered our medical expenses and established a college fund for my son. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring Linda to undergo anger management counseling and community service focused on helping families in medical crisis. I never wanted to profit from our ordeal, but I wanted Linda to understand the real-world impact of her actions on families like ours. The criminal conviction followed Linda for years afterward. She lost her job in medical billing when her employer learned about the child endangerment charges. She was forced to move out of Sunset Ridge when the Homeowners Association insurance company refused to cover any community with her as a resident. But the most satisfying consequence was watching our neighborhood transform from a place ruled by fear into a genuine community. The Johnsons, who had been cited for their fence height, organized a neighborhood watch program that brought families together for monthly meetings and social events. Mrs. Chen started a community garden where neighbors shared vegetables and parenting advice. The elderly couple on Oak Street became unofficial neighborhood historians, sharing stories about the families who had lived here before HOA regulations changed everything. My identity as county sheriff became public knowledge after the trial, but instead of creating distance between my family and our neighbors, it brought us closer together.